we have to understand what the edge is, our own edges, in service of our learning and transformation, that of self or the group or society.
Welcome to the podcast Group Dynamics. My name is Roland Schuster. This is the second part of a conversation with Carmen Lane. There is always this aspect of embodied culture. You even said there is a containment of a certain time in life. As far as I can tell, I'm now in my mid-50s, and I can very sure tell people that this is a different age than if you are in your mid-20s. and,
There's a
and so,
different experience going
yes,
on.
totally. Life felt different to myself, yeah. Yeah, and so it's already enough if you have a group of people that have a different age and you already have differences that might be interesting to look at in the presence. Or did I use the word presence in the wrong way right now? I don't know.
No, I think, these words have whatever meaning we put on them sometimes. But what works for you? For me, the question is what's working for me in my kind of toolbox and, ecosystem for my practice and how I do group work. I don't think there's anything that isn't a resource for me to understand group dynamics. So, for example, I'm currently in the Everglades right now on an artist residency through the national parks in Florida. And these are the traditional and homelands of the Seminole and Miccosukee people. And the park is currently being stewarded by the National Park Service of the United States. And they created an artist residency for artists to be in the environment of the space for learning. And so it's one of the most biodiverse environments in the world. And so although there are, flora and fauna and animals and human beings who are indigenous to these lands, it has always been a place and space where animals and plant life from all over, North America also find home and ability to thrive in that environment. And so I've been thinking about that. What does it mean that this place is also and has continued to be a container for other kinds of life in relationship to those who are indigenous to it? And, it's mating season right now. So it has me thinking about dyads, and learning about dyadic energy. And so the alligators, the way that they mate between each other is that they engage in these bellow sounds and and it's an indicator of size. And so the alligator will bellow to let you know its size. And, it becomes like a call and response between the alligators to find a mate. But it's also a call and response for another potential mate to know that their size is larger and to not challenge their interest in the other alligator. And so the bellow sounds have this purpose. And when I first heard the sounds, it reminded me of the singer Barry White's voice when he would sing love songs. And so it got me curious about whether or not, Barry White would ever have access to that knowledge, to those learnings of those sounds that these alligators make. And I discovered that Barry White was born in Galveston, Texas, which is a Gulf Coast community. So potentially in his art form and in his understanding of that dyadic energy between two people, that there's a certain sound and an energy that expresses connection in the dyad. And so for me, that's a way to experiment and play around with our understanding of groups. Nature, plant life, growth, all of that is a resource to us.
And so there is a group dynamic layer that is deeper than the layer of the verbal expression, which is pretty much a very new expression and a very young expression in human togetherness. And then you have the situation, like you said, you have this sort of embodied appearance, and then the rumbling starts. It seems that especially in the very deep layers of communication, like you made now the example of this, of the alligators, it seems that there are more similarities than in the higher up layers.
I would say so. All of these things that we have created scholarship theory and method out of come from experience. To be an applied behavioral scientist, right, is about the intersection of being a scholar practitioner. That our lived experience informs how we make meaning in a theoretical and experimentation, in the framework of experimentation and theory making. And I appreciate that. That resonates with my own values, that although the container may have changed or how we're contained has changed, from in terms of how we live in houses, how we work, that those very fundamental pieces around what it means to be together is an ongoing question that we have to fundamentally wrestle with and reckon with as human beings. And we have to, as behavioral scientists, ask ourselves how we're also contributing to ongoing tensions in the way that we are creating this body of knowledge and embodying it as practitioners. So when I think about the example you gave, I think we often perceive ourselves as different than those who came before us because we have access to technologies that bring us together in work groups in different ways. But between you and I, as an example, my grandfather was a veteran of World War II. So he traveled to England, he traveled to Germany, he traveled to the Philippines in the context of war, and that gave him a perspective and a perception of people who are different than him, and not just different than him because of nation status or gender or race, but his perception was based on the influence of the containment of war. And that influence, whether I'm conscious of it or not, has informed my meaning making about people who are different from me, who occupy those places. So I have work to do to disentangle myself from those stories and meaning makings of my grandfather to be able to be in the here and now with Roland.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. And disentanglement, for example, can happen within a HI lab, for example, within a
Yes.
group dynamic special setting that takes into account that there might be something like, or not only might be, that there is an embodiment of whatever came before us, of our ancestors. And then you have the chance in a setting, facilitating in a group dynamical way, contained in a group dynamical way, you have the chance to look at this heritage and to somehow maybe even, well, you can even keep things, but at least you have to choose, or at least you might be able to experience that there are choices.
And be courageous enough to play at those edges of choice, because you can observe it, you can pay attention to the tension in your body about it, you can journal about it, but without that intervention, that choice to have contact at that boundary of difference, in some ways it's a learning, but it's a missed opportunity for contact and change. Because there's no contact without interruption. You can feel the energy, you can pay attention to the sensations, you can become aware of the place in your body or the history in yourself where those tensions are coming from. But if you don't experiment with some co-meaning making with a group or another, that is leaving something unfinished in you. and finished in the group.
Ah, okay, now I got it. So it's not enough to get somehow in touch with deeper layers of your body, but it's also to figure out that there is the possibility that this getting in touch could also have different qualities, or could also evoke different behavior from the touched one, or I can change my behavior and have a look how this changes how people are addressing myself within a group.
Absolutely. I mean, I think about it in I'm a big fan of visual culture and film and the kinds of storytellings that film makes, both covertly and, not so. I'm more interested in the covert than in the overt storytelling. But I think about that moment in watching some kind of thriller where I, as the viewer, figure out before the character that somebody's presence isn't actually reflected in who they are. And so when I'm watching it, I say, oh, that person is really the villain. And so that excites me to see, is this character going to stay in this kind of automatic kind of binary relationship with this person, or are they going to pay attention and figure out, and when is that going to be uncovered? Like, I get excited at that moment of storytelling, but I also get excited in that way in doing group work. There are times when I can notice that a participant is at the edge of an awareness, and I get excited about the possibility of, what is this person going to do about it or not? And how can I intervene in a way that supports them in, hey, if you want to do that work, I'm here. I'm happy to support it. Or, Roland and I as co-facilitators are happy to support it. Whatever that work is. But there's an energy, right? To your point, in this kind of primal energy of being a human being, of being a being on a interconnected planet, that we are tracking energy and making decisions and intervening based on those sensations. We are doing it. But to be a practitioner or to pay attention to it in service of group learning, then we have to raise the group's consciousness on its ability to track energy without a valence, without judging that energy.
Well, this is probably the most difficult part in the whole game for everybody, but especially for the facilitator, because the facilitator has probably more responsibility in this whole setting than all the other participants. What comes to my mind is that you told a little bit about your grandfather and about he was at several places in the world, all in the context of war. This brings me back to the founder of the NTL, which was Kurt Lewin. And we have, as you told me before we started our talk today, we have the 75th anniversary of NTL. And interestingly, Lewin was a refugee, and his context was also the times of war, and he did a lot of thinking and writing and also experiencing with different styles of leadership and the question about cultures, for example. For me, it's touching that a person that is so close in contact with war, and as we can see nowadays, we are still in danger of being in close contact to war. I think it might be a big task to think about how to get in contact with each other, with different cultures and so forth, in a more group dynamical way and not in the way that we have war between cultures. I think it's important not to underestimate the rumbling, and it's important not to underestimate the art of being able to get people in contact to each other that has an outcome that is, in a sense, positive. It might not be positive in a way that everybody is happy, but at least positive in a way that everybody is able to get in contact with each other without trying to killing each other.
No, this resonates deeply with me, Roland, on so many levels, because not only, are we at a point of awareness that there is war in Eastern Europe again, that there is an intervention happening in a particular place in Eastern Europe of a particular group's ethnic identity, that in Ukraine, the leadership is saying we are not just fighting for our homelands, but for our identity as Ukrainian people. That Lewin, as a not just a refugee, but one of the first refugee scholars, so he was able to get access to support by the United States as a scholar, and that he was Polish, you know. So he was a Polish Jew, and I think that that is significant in terms of kind of the geolocation of how this work has emerged in the world 75 years later. And so when I think about the significance of migration in Lewin's meaning making, that he could understand his self in relationship to other based on the shifting self in the various environments that he found himself in, that he was a student of pearls. So Gestalt is also in the origins of NTL, and in is an ingredient in the body of knowledge that Lewin developed and we have been experimenters of. And I don't know how successful we've been, right, in the potentiality of his work. And what are the experiences that we need in order to integrate and expand and bring to the here and now, not the legacy of Lewin, but his theory and method in service of very practical issues and critical issues in our world. So when I think about him moving from one geography to another, and that geography was where this work was born, is significant. So that there is this relationship between the US and Europe in the founding of NTL, in the grounding and the rooting of Lewin's work, because he first started experimenting with T groups in the context of race and across, you know, white Americans and Black Americans in a academic context. And that's a very particular one. But when I think about the construct of race and gender and class within a US context impacting the global dynamics of group, it becomes even more, Lewin then becomes even more critical that we understand the influence of a particular culture on the global stage. And so it isn't about us having some kind of monoculture, but what is the requirement in our professional practice to understand the levels of system present on the global stage impacting our abilities to have contact as human beings from a systems perspective. And I think that's the power of Lewin. That's the power of T Group, because people are afraid to do different things. So if they can experiment, if they can create a tiny experiment to do something different and track the outcome of that experiment, then potentially that person will then practice again, you know, someplace else, and be able to integrate that learning into a new behavior.
This was the second part of a conversation with Carmen. I hope you enjoyed the session. Stay tuned.